It's time's now 6:30 and we will make a start. Before we go any further though, just as a reminder please to everybody, please speak clearly into your microphones, adjust them, make sure that everybody can hear what is being said. We are going to do a minute's silence in a little while, but I'm going to ask please for the committee clerk to read out the public announcement first, and then we'll introduce ourselves and then we will have a minute's silence. Thank you.
Good evening. Council members, officers and members of the public are reminded that the use of mobile electronic devices during all meetings of the Council held in public is permitted, but for the use of Wi-Fi purposes only. You are asked to please leave the meeting should you wish to make or receive a telephone call. If the fire alarm goes off this evening, which we hope it won't, please proceed down the stairs, out at the main reception and congregate in Queen's Gardens until you are advised it's safe to return. The members of the committee will now introduce themselves.
Thank you. Councillor Paul Scott, Chair of the Planning Committee.
My name is Sean Murphy, Legal Advisor to the committee.
Margot Rowan, Committee Manager.
Oh, it's working now. Councillor Wayne Trackus Lawless, South Norwood Ward.
Councillor Bernadette Khan, West Thornton Ward.
Good evening. Jamie Audsley, Councillor in Bensham Manor.
Councillor Joy Prince, Wadden Ward.
Laura Field, Deputy Team Leader, Development Management.
I'm Heather Cheeseborough, I'm Director of Planning and Strategic Transport.
Thank you very much, everybody. If we could make sure that we have all got microphones that work, that would be very helpful. We are webcasting the meeting this evening, and obviously the webcasting is related to the use of the microphones. So are we happy now that they're all working properly? Everybody could just try turning this on.
Yes.
Turn yours off now.
Well, this one's working.
Okay, we seem to have probably enough of them working at least. Please do make sure, members of the committee, when you're speaking, that your red light has come on. Hopefully, as the evening goes on, the technology will start to work a little bit better. Okay then. Before we go any further, obviously we'll all be aware of the awful events last week at Grenfell Tower and the terrible loss of life and the impact on the whole community. So I'm going to ask everybody please to stand for a minute's silence in respect of those that have been affected. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Before we go any further, I'm just going to ask Heather Cheeseborough to give us a quick explanation, though, in terms of the difference between the planning decisions that we're making and how that they are different from building control matters that control things such as, tended to control things such as fire safety in buildings. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you, Chair. Just to remind members, because I'm sure most of you know, but building control and planning legislation are two entirely separate regimes, regulatory regimes. And although building control, we have a building control, local authority building control service, and planning officers do work together informally and internally to share advice and expertise and to inform the development of proposals that goes right from pre-application to the discharge of conditions. When planning decisions are taken, and in particular around what you're doing here, you are making decisions on a planning application entirely within the planning framework. Decisions on building control are under the Building Act, an entirely separate regime. Obviously, in terms of planning legislation, you're making decisions really about the aesthetics, largely about the aesthetics of proposals. Building control is a far more technical process and is involved with matters of health and safety, energy efficiency, ensuring correct access and facilities for the disabled. So that's a very different regime, and that is not something that you should be taking into consideration. That building regulation issue, that's an entirely separate issue, and that's not for your consideration. You very clearly are making decisions under the planning framework and planning policy.
Thank you for clarifying that, because I'm sure a number of us have been worried about how the impact, what sort of impact there could be from the decisions we're making on, particularly, obviously, the issues around fire safety. I think you clarified that point very well, so thank you for that. Okay, before going actually onto the agenda itself, I forgot to mention a moment ago, just to advise everybody, we are webcasting the meeting, and anybody that's taking part in the meeting this evening, be they obviously members of the committee, but also members of the public who are addressing us this evening, will be webcast as part of that process. Okay then, so first item on the agenda, apologies for absence, and we have no apologies this evening. Minutes of the meeting held on Wednesday the 24th of May, are those agreed? Agreed? Yes, yep. Thank you. Do we have any disclosures of interest regarding the items on the agenda before us this evening? No. We have no items of urgent business, no exempt items and no development presentations. So it brings us on to the three applications for decision this evening. We're going to take those in the order of 7.2, 7.3 and then 7.1. So the first of those, item 7.2 for Rectory Park, South Croydon. The presenting officer on that will be Pete Smith. Pete, when you're ready, please.
Good evening, members. Thank you, Chair. So this application on your papers this evening is in respect to 4 Rectory Park, and the proposal is a redevelopment of an existing detached property. It's a 2-storey detached property, and the proposal is for a replacement 2-storey property comprising 6 2-bed flats with vehicle access from Borrowdale Drive and the provision of associated car parking spaces. Whilst the property is proposed as 2 storeys, 2 of the flats are proposed within the roof space. So, moving on to the next slide. This is the site itself. As you can see, the property is on the corner of Rectory Park and Borrowdale Drive, and so Rectory Park slopes down from north east down to south west. As you can see, it's on the corner. The main frontage, in fact, is onto Rectory Park, although the main entrance is actually on the corner. It's got a fairly large rear garden, as you can see. Borrowdale Drive is characterised by bungalows, mostly detached properties on the opposite side of Rectory Park, similar forms of design, but there are some properties within the area that have gable features as well, Chair. Moving on to the next slide is a Google Earth image. As you can see there, the 2 properties. This is number 2 Rectory Park, and this is the application property. As you can see, the rear garden. This is where the bungalows start within Borrowdale Drive, and it gives a flavour of the the general environs. Moving on, this is just another Google Earth image. As you can see, it's a fairly verdant field with with large rear gardens, but again mostly detached properties. Moving on to some photographs of the site itself. This is the application site with the double garage on the corner. This is the main porch, which was previously extended. As you see, it sort of relates to the corner to a certain extent, and we've got a previously extended detached house next door, which is number 2. Not wishing to sort of think that we were in hot weather at the moment, Chair, but this is obviously taken at a different time of the year. But this is taken from the rear garden towards the first bungalow in Borrowdale Drive. It's a single-storey property, which is the first property, and it's, today it was fairly heavily landscaped along the boundary, but obviously at that time of the year it was fairly open. Moving on to the plans, this is the existing property as we see it today, and the proposal, as I've said, is a 2-storey building detached with 2 flats on each floor, including the roof space, with 6 car parking spaces, 1 for each of the flats themselves, along with bike storage at the rear, communal space, amenity space at the rear, with also private amenity space for each of the units adjacent to the building itself. Looking at that in a bit more detail, and it's the ground floor plan. You can see that, as I say, there's 2 flats on this ground floor here. I think the important aspects of this scheme, and it's a number of schemes that are proposed by this developer, is in fact the importance of having a through route through the development. So everybody can enter the building off the street, but they can also gain access from the car park directly. So there's a very logical and legible way of actually entering the building, whether you're coming by car or coming as a pedestrian. And you can see also there's a separate entrance on the Borrowdale Drive, which will take you to the bin store at the side here, which again is compliant in terms of refuse storage and collection, and then there's a proposed bike store at the rear. Moving on to the next slide, this is gives a flavour of the elevation onto Rectory Park. As I've said, it's a symmetrical form of development with 2 double height bays with with rooms in the roof, so within the gable feature at second floor level. As I say, 2 flats on each. Well, it's 6 2-bed flats, good quality, 2-bed 4-person units, all meeting the London Plan standards as well as the national technical standards in terms of room size and overall flat size, with their own amenity space, whether it's communal or private amenity space. You can see the relationship here with the adjacent property at number 2, and it does reflect, and if I could take you back to the photograph that we had, you can see that there is a change in level as you go down the hill, and that's reflected also in the proposals around eaves height and relationships. The footprint of the building is slightly different from the existing footprint of the existing property, but we feel because it's a corner property, it can have some presence, and it can project beyond that front building line, and there is scope, we feel, for a much more larger footprint to accommodate an increased amount of development, whilst at the same time maintaining quality and maintaining the amenities of immediate neighbours. Again, that lower slide gives a flavour of blank elevations. That's, that would be the elevation onto the neighbouring property at number 2, Rectory Park. Again, this is the rear elevation. Again, you can see the relationship with number 2, Rectory Park there. And as we go up the further hill, this is on the other side of Borrowdale Drive, which is again a fairly substantial property on the corner. And this again is the view that you have from the property onto Borrowdale Drive, with the access I've just mentioned, which is the access into the bin store. That's the end of the slide. So, Chair, we are recommending a grant of planning permission. We feel that, again, it's providing additional accommodation in line with the need to provide more housing accommodation within the borough, but it's also providing good quality 2-bed 4-person units, we believe, alongside good quality amenity space and parking for those occupiers. Parking within Bungalow Drive on street is not stressed, so there is capacity for further parking on street should it be necessary. The density is slightly higher than what one would, the land and plan standards are suggesting, but as we've discussed many times at this committee, density is a guide, but it also needs to be reflective of character, but also the other elements that go with a scheme to make it acceptable, i.e. car parking, amenity space, and actually relationships with existing property, and we feel that is satisfied. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions, clarification? Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Chairman. Could I just ask for clarification, really, in the report at 8.12 and 8.13, talking about amenity space? Do I gather that an amenity space for this particular development is adequate? It doesn't seem to say it is or it isn't.
Thank you, Councillor Wright. Yes, it is adequate. The standards for amenities for private amenity space is 5 square metres per unit. That's for a 2-person unit, but then you add 1 square metre for additional person, and we're in 4-person units here, and it does meet those standards. There is a mixture of private and communal amenity space, taking you back to the image that I showed at the start. This is an area of communal space, which I've said all residents can have access to, and we will need to look at landscaping quite carefully in terms of the treatment of the boundaries to make sure that there is some privacy and it actually works as an amenity space, and that's conditioned, but we feel that amenity space is acceptable.
Any further questions? No? Then we'll move on to the 3 people wishing to address us on this item. We have Ms. who is an objector. We have Mr. Nam, who is the applicant's agent, and we have Councillor Pollard, who is a referring board member. If you'd all like to come forward, please. Each of you will have up to 3 minutes to tell us about your particular views on this application. Starting with Ms. when you're ready, please. Yes. No, you just push it. Hopefully. Push the button down.
Okay, thank you. I've spoken to a good number of the residents of Borrowdale Drive and the houses around the proposed development, and here is a summary of our objections. Our primary concern is the potential number of cars the development could and probably will generate. Usually the occupants of 2-bed flats will own a car each. This means the 6 parking bays within the site will be totally inadequate, and the overflow of cars will be parked down Borrowdale Drive, adding to the already existing congestion. This will naturally have an impact on the quality of life of the local residents, as well as being a potential safety risk to the numerous school children who cross the road at the end of the road, and the football-playing children whose parents use Borrowdale Drive to park in on Saturday mornings and some evenings in the week at dusk. Also, the headlights of the cars owned by the residents of the proposed flats will shine into the bedroom of the residents at number 2 Borrowdale Drive as they turn into the proposed parking area, which will be a constant aggravation. This is causing considerable anxiety to the occupants of number 2, neither of whom enjoy robust health. The garden of 4 Rectory Park has a good number of trees and shrubbery in it, which all help to support wildlife. The development will, of necessity, cause the loss of a significant amount of greenery, be it grass or shrubbery, as it will have to be paved over as a car park. The property itself will also be considerably bigger than the existing house, and this will represent a large increase of the man-made footprint compared with the property as it is at the moment. I feel the Council should consider this, particularly as we have a much appreciated population of bats in our back gardens in this area. Our opinion in the neighbourhood is that the development is out of character with the area, which is all single ownership houses and bungalows. The Council was keen to insist that the directive of single-storey buildings only in Borrowdale Drive be adhered to with regard to the plot of land adjacent to 1A Borrowdale Drive, and yet this proposed property will extend well into Borrowdale Drive and totally flout the Council's own directive, although its address is technically Rectory Park. The apartments would have a negative impact on the lives of the surrounding residents, many of whom are frail and elderly. Borrowdale Drive was built as an open-plan quart cul-de-sac of bungalows, generally occupied by the retired, and this is the basis upon which the occupants have bought property and settled in this road. It would be riding roughshod over these people to cynically turn it into an overflow car park for a wholly inappropriate development of apartments. It seems unfair also that one family's quest for financial gain directly results in their neighbour's financial loss, as none of us can delude ourselves that this development will not reduce the value of the surrounding houses.
Ms. I'm afraid your time is up, but thank you very much. Thank you. Okay then, if you wouldn't mind pushing the button again. That's it, thank you very much. And then Mr. Nam, you've got up to 3 minutes to tell us about your application. Thank you.
Good evening. The application before you is a housing application for 6 flats in a 2-storey building. The application site is a large plot, and at the moment there is an existing 2-storey single-family dwelling house on site. We are proposing to replace this dwelling with a new 2-storey building to deliver 6 2-bedroom flats. The new building has been carefully designed to look like a detached dwelling from the outside, and the existing dwelling and the new building would look very similar. We have had extensive pre-application discussions with the planning department prior to the application and have revised the design of the scheme over time to get to where we are today. During these discussions, we have carefully listened to the concerns raised and addressed all the issues, including scale, massing, design, parking and amenity space. We believe that the scheme has improved significantly over this period. Therefore, the scheme now is supported by the Council's planning team, and the officer recommendation is to approve the scheme. The planning team does not have any concerns about the visual impact of the scheme, and they do not consider the proposal to be overdevelopment of the site. All flats would be large enough to meet the standards, would have access to private or communal gardens, and would be high-quality dwellings. The planning team does not have any concerns about the impact of the scheme on neighbours' living conditions either. The proposal would increase the soft landscaping at the site and would provide sufficient car parking and cycle parking spaces. We believe that the Council has much to gain from this development. The scheme will deliver additional dwelling in a residential location without any unacceptable harm. New housing at this moment is particularly important as we have a housing crisis in London. The scheme will contribute to additional council tax revenue, new homes bonus, sale payments, which will support local services. We believe that the scheme is a sustainable development that both the Council and the Government would wish to have. Therefore, we believe that the scheme should be approved this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. If you wouldn't mind pushing the button to turn the microphone off, thank you very much. And Councillor Pollard, once we've got the
Thank you, Chair.
Stopwatch set up. 1 second. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I do love the way we persist in describing these flatted developments as 2 stories, because, of course, the practical reality is this is a 3-storey building in an area that doesn't have any other 3-storey buildings, but I do accept that in terms of planning policy, that's not a reason for refusal. Mr. Smith referred to the London plan and the density of development here. It's worth pointing out that the London plan allows for a density of between 150 and 200 can't read without my glasses, hectares, but the proposed development is 252, which is 20% higher. So it's 20% higher than the maximum covered in the London plan. In terms of detrimental effect upon the residential amenity, the application site's in a very prominent position with the ground falling away. It's right on the edge of Greenbelt also. The elevations that we saw earlier are all done from the perspective of Rectory Park, of course omitting to look at the effect of this building as seen from Borrowdale Drive, where of course it is substantially more prominent than anything in Borrowdale Drive, which is sort of uniformly low bungalows. So I think in terms of the aspect from Borrowdale Drive, it will have a very, very dominant effect on the street scene. On-site parking rather, is also a significant worry. When you actually look at how the layout is produced, it seems fairly clear that several of the car parking spaces will not be able to turn within the car park and will have to reverse back out onto Borrowdale Drive, which obviously has a potential safety impact. So it seems to me that this is a development where a smaller development of, say, 4 flats would probably not be inappropriate, but the sheer bulk of what is proposed is just quite simply out of character with what is in the locality and in particular in Borrowdale Drive. So I would urge the committee to refuse planning permission. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Do officers have anything further to add?
Just picking up on a few of those points, in terms of car parking, first off, it meets London Plan standards in terms of the amount of car parking spaces provided. In addition, officers will have been out on site and they note there is plenty of capacity in the area for on-street car parking. In terms of issues around landscaping, there is adequate landscaping buffers all around the boundary treatment, particularly providing good boundary between this property and number 2 Borrowdale. Plenty of landscaping will be provided by condition. In terms of issues around character, the property has been designed, although it's flats, to look like a single-family dwelling, which is pretty much what is there at the moment. So officers are quite satisfied in terms of character and appearance that it fits well within the area. And in terms of the prominent corner per site, it's considered that actually a development of this size is the right and appropriate approach to it and fits well with the character. And the discussion around whether it's 3-storey or 2-storey, the building is effectively a 2-storey dwelling. It's not out of character, not out of size with the development next door to it. So, and as the case officer made the case, the flats are in the roof space, so it is effectively a 2-storey building. So we're satisfied very much that it fits with the character and appearance of the area.
Thank you very much. Could you just comment briefly on the issue about cars being able to turn on site and enter and leave in forward gear?
Yes, if members note paragraph 8.27, in terms of access and parking, vehicles will be able to enter and exit the location in forward gear.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Prince? Sorry, Mr Smith, did you want to come back on something else?
I just wanted to respond a bit to Councillor Pollard's point around the 2 and the 3-storey. I think the important part of this scheme is that they're looking at duplex units within the development itself. So when you're talking about rooms in the roof, because of the way in which the development works, you're looking at bedrooms within the roof. So it works quite well, and that's part of the reason why we're particularly keen on the quality of the development, because the way in which the developer's looking at ways in which you have separation between bedroom and living accommodation. I think it works really well on this scheme, and that's why they're making good use of the roof, like many people do. If you're in a single-family dwelling, people like to make use of their roof to expand, and that's in many ways why we think that this is a really good arrangement, and this developer is looking at that a lot, of duplex units, to actually make the scheme work quite well in terms of quality of flatted accommodation.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Prince?
Yes, I wonder if officers could comment on one thing which doesn't seem to be in the report that was mentioned, and that was bats, a colony of bats, or the use of green space by bats.
That's the first we've heard of that. It's not an area that we would, it's a cultivated garden. So in terms of nature conservation value, we don't feel it's necessary to do that. I mean, bats move around, and move between. As I say, if there is any protected species that are affected by this, whether it's in the existing house itself or whether it's within some of the elements within the site itself, then there is a licence process that one needs to go through, and there's an informative that we put onto to require that to take place.
Okay, Councillor Wright, then I'll bring myself in, and Councillor Perry.
Chairman, I quite understand this is a fairly big plot, and obviously the design and the of the property, what was designed, is probably very good. My problem really is the location. This development in a location will probably be quite good. What we have here is on a corner development, a very prominent site, and you have a large building, which I think we can really relate it to Borrowdale Drive rather than from Rectory Grove, because Borrowdale Drive has been quite clearly mentioned a great deal of bungalows and small rise dwellings, and this is very dominant. So that is probably a large building with a dominant on that particular site, when really you need something which will lead you into Borrowdale Drive to the character of it. So what we have is really a development which is an overdevelopment for that particular side, but it's also dominant in its position and out of character with the area and along Borrowdale Drive. So it is a pity in a way, because it would be a good development, but it's because of its in location, and it's put on a site which should not have a development of this size. So I propose refusal, Mr. Chairman, based on an overdevelopment and out of character with the local Borrowdale Drive. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right, I think I have to say I think this is a well-considered scheme. I think it would actually sit on the site well, and unlike Councillor Wright, I think the fact that it's on a corner site, if anything, allows it to be a slightly bigger, slightly more prominent building. That's something we very often see within our sort of the urban design of many areas, frankly. We've heard already that the scale of the building is very similar to the houses that are actually in the immediate area already, and is actually set away, as we can see on the plan there, from the Borrowdale Drive properties, which do step down and are smaller in scale, separated by the car park. So I think that does actually allow that sort of breathing space to actually happen for a 2/3 or 2 plus the roof storey building. I think the accommodation that's proposed, it is very positive to see a block like this, but with maisonettes in, which will make very good homes, good size, and they're all 2-bed, 4-person units, which are very flexible in terms of small families, people wanting to downsize from a house who might live in the immediate area, youngsters moving out and second or first or second home in the area where they grew up, that kind of thing. So it's a very, very flexible form of housing. Most of the units have their own garden as well, plus there's the shared community space too, so I think that's very positive. And as we all know, we have a significant housing need, and providing a small block of flats like this in this area, I think will actually help a small way to meet that housing need, whilst creating a greater mix in the local area without having a negative impact on the local area. So I'm happy to move the officer's recommendation for approval. Councillor Perry.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I think it's fair to say that this could be a development site, and I think it could probably take a reasonably sized block. I take the point about it being a corner, but I think we need to realise or understand this corner leads to a fairly modest cul-de-sac of bungalows. And in that context, it's becoming rather large, I think, for its surrounding environment. I think the other issue that says it's too large is that the building line in Rectory Park is being brought considerably forward of where it is currently. So this building will protrude into Rectory Park and not follow the line of Rectory Park that we have today, and it's quite an established line of housing down Rectory Park. I think because too much is being squeezed in a number of flats, it's become excessive on its bulk and massing. And I think that, in turn, leads to it becoming out of character and dominating in the street scene, particularly with regard to Borrowdale Drive, where I think this will be particularly dominant when in that road. And I think it's unfortunate we haven't seen that aspect in the presentation before us this evening. So I think, yes, it could be a development site, but I think this is an overdevelopment. It's much too large a footprint, and it's an excessive bulk and massing, and I would second refusal.
Okay, thank you. Would officers like to comment on the point about the building line? I mean, personally, I would have thought that there isn't really a particularly established building line, but do officers have a view on that? Could you give us a comment? Because it does clearly step forward of where the existing building is.
Yes, in certain parts of Rectory Park, because it does curve, there is, in certain parts of Rectory Park, a step building line. We feel, even though it does project, basically because of the quality of the frontage anyway, it will still always front onto Rectory Park. I think with the quality of the design that comes forward on the frontage, but also because of its corner status, we feel that that projection works in urban design terms. I think there is good separation as you step back from the Borrowdale Drive properties, and I think the separation, which is about 17 metres from the first bungalow at 2 Borrowdale Drive, gives that separation and a change in character. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Kabir?
Thank you, Chair. In my view, this is a very right design because it's respecting the neighbourhood. It is not actually overcrowded or too much mess is not overloaded. So therefore, I have no reason not to support and move for second-day approval because it is fitting all the bills. There's particularly car park spaces there. There are surrounding greens on all sides. So what more can we ask? If this application was in some other part of the borough, I bet it would have been 8 flats or more, or full 3-story plus the rooftop. So I think it has respected the surrounding area. So I'm going to support this.
Okay, thank you. Can I see anybody else wishing to speak? Councillor Clancy?
Thank you, Chair. I support the arguments put forward by Councillor Perry and Councillor Wright, and I won't be supporting this. I won't repeat what they've already said, but I would ask if, in fact, this application does get approved tonight, would it be possible to condition some form of mitigation to ameliorate the concern that's been expressed about the headlights of cars shining into the adjoining property, perhaps some form of screening?
Mr. Smith?
Yes, we can. As I say, there are, I'm just looking back at the papers, there is a landscaping condition, and as part of that landscaping condition, we could include, well, clearly that's with boundary treatment as well, so we could, in the detailed wording of the landscaping condition, we could include boundary treatment and then think about how one could look at a visible screen while still softening the appearance of the boundary for the gardens. I think it's important that there is a mixture of hard and soft landscaping on the boundaries.
Thank you. We should sort of, so if this is approved, we should then reinforce that within that condition, and we'd actually put that into the wording of the condition.
Yeah, happy to do that, Chair. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Councillor Prince?
Yes, again without repeating previous things, I would also support this application, and particularly pleased to see that there would be a wildlife informative, so that puts my mind at rest about the bats. Thank you.
Thank you. I haven't seen anybody else indicate. So we have 2 motions completed. The first was for refusal, moved by Councillor Wright and seconded by Councillor Perry on the grounds of overdevelopment, out of character and dominance of the local area. And thank you, sir. And then we have the second motion, which is to approve, moved by myself and seconded by Councillor Kabir. I'm more than happy if that motion is accepted, approved, for the condition strengthening the point around the landscape and landscape boundary and headlights being included within the actual wording of the condition. I think that's an important mitigation measure. So, the first of those first. Can I see those in favour of refusal? 4. And those against?
6.
So that is not refused. That motion falls. Can I see those in favour of approval?
6.
And those against?
4.
So that is approved. Thank you very much. Okay. That moves us on to the second item for decision this evening, item 7.3, number 21, Melville Avenue, South Croydon. The presenting officer on this one is Laura Field. Laura, as soon as you're ready, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This application is at 21 Melville Avenue for the demolition of the existing bungalow, the erection of a detached three-storey building with a lower ground floor level containing 5 flats, 4 two-bedroom and 1 three-bedroom, alterations to the vehicular access and provision of associated parking. This slide shows the site in context. You can see the application site here and outlined in red in the site plan below. The site is quite unusual within the street scene, being the only bungalow within a row of large detached houses, as you can see by the street view photograph here. The site is a bungalow here with a detached garage here. The neighbouring property is a large detached house here. This is number 5 Melville Avenue and is a locally listed building. There is a school opposite the site and several other large detached houses following along Melville Avenue. The neighbour is number 23, which has recent planning permission for conversion into flats and extensions including 2- and 3-storey extensions to the rear of the property. Number 25 Melville Avenue is again a locally listed building. There are flats on the corner of Melville Avenue here as well. This shows the photograph directly opposite the site, showing the site here. As I said, it's a bungalow which is quite unusual within the street scene, set amongst 2-storey houses, this being number 23 here and number 5 here. This is number 5, the locally listed building, the neighbouring site here, and number 23 here. This shows the relationship between the site here and number 5 Melville Avenue here. In the officer's report, there are numbers which refer to each of the windows. It has an unusual relationship to the application site, given the number of flank windows. So the numbers of the habitable rooms are starting from the top of in the attic. So that's an attic bedroom here, a bedroom here, and a breakfast room here. So rooms 2 and 3, 5 and 6, and 9 and 10. The photograph below shows the application site in relation to number 23. You can note there are no habitable room windows on number 23. I visited the application site and the neighbouring site with those windows. So as you can see from this slide, this is inside number 5 Melville Avenue. You can see the breakfast room and kitchen are an open plan with the kitchen towards the rear of the site. That's a rear window on ground floor facing the garden area and comes through to the breakfast room here. This is the breakfast room looking towards the application site, so windows 9 and 10, which relate to the officer's report. And this is the breakfast room. The lower parts of the window are obscure glaze, and the top of the windows, you can see the roof form of the bungalow here. Rooms 5 and 6 are on the first floor bedroom. Again, you can see the roof form of the bungalow and the roof form of the garage here. Moving up to the attic bedroom, which looks directly onto number 23. These photographs just show the rear of the site, again the bungalow here. You can notice there is a slight change of land level here. Number 23, which has the recent approval with various extensions and conversion into flats. And looking the other way to number 5 Melville Avenue, This photograph here shows the relationship between the existing number 5 onto the application site. You can notice the garage here. This photograph shows, looking further down the application site, and the landscaping, which is largely to be retained. Moving on to the proposal and the site plan here. So the proposal is for 5 car parking spaces here with access onto Melville Avenue. The proposal is to have a landscaping strip which responds to the character of the area, which have basic landscaping strips on the frontage, with this being grasscrete, again to respond to that character and landscaping of the area. The building has a lower ground and a first and second floor, which the footprint responds well to the building line of Melville Avenue and picks up the form of 5 Melville Avenue and steps down for the building line to respond again to number 23. At lower ground floor, there's one unit, which is a two 4-bedroom unit, and each of the units have their own access, which is provides a good quality environment. Flats 2 and 3 are on the ground floor, and going into first floor are duplex units for flats 4 and 5. On the ground floor, the application steps in here to respond to the number 5 and those habitable rooms which were previously seen in the slide. So it steps away to range from 3.1 to 4.9 metres here. On first floor, the application does not extend beyond the rear building line here. Again, looking to respond to that relationship between number 5 Melville Avenue. From this slide, you can see the elevations. It's a contemporary approach to the building and responds well to the character, where it picks up the hips of the features of the buildings in the large detached buildings here. The use of traditional and contemporary materials is also used to provide a well-designed building. So the use of clay tiles in the upper floors and a reflective mirror contemporary material on the lower ground. The rear of the property also picks up on these features of the hipped roofs, and again has that contemporary approach to respond well to the character of the area, and also to that change of land levels on the site that we saw on the photograph, with having green roofs and landscaping, again to step away from the number 5 Melville Avenue and respond well to the relationship between the two buildings. The elevations, again, show that relationship and how the building takes on board the gentle slope of the site and produces high-quality environment for the living conditions of future occupiers, with the ground floor having own amenity space, and indeed the first and second floor with privacy screens and green roofs. This is a CGI of the site, again picking up on that form of development that we saw on the previous slide, again picking up on those traditional forms of the road whilst having a good quality contemporary approach to the building. Again, you can see the grasscrete approach here, picking up on the landscaping features of the road. These are the rear elevations CGI, which seeks to address the relationship with the neighbouring property by stepping the building down here and having privacy screens and having the lower ground floor, which relates well to the neighbour here. Thank you, Chair. The recommendation is to grant planning permission.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions or clarification? Councillor Audsley?
Thank you, Chair. Just as we look at this image, the material on the kind of lower half of the building, just wondered if we could kind of hear what that is in more detail, and perhaps for those in the public gallery to kind of understand. It looks like mirrors, but is it kind of reflective, metallic, etc.? Thank you.
Yes, so the material is a mirror. It's a material it's a material that's it's a material which is a mirror. so it is material, it's mirror. So it mirrors the landscaping of the road. So it's material, it's mirror panels and a reflective. Before I bring in Councillor Wimborne, just to sort of pick up on the same sort of point. Whilst appreciating the sort of modern approach, is a mirrored glass sort of or mirror effect, particularly given that that's the car park there, so we actually see is the reflection of the cars, really an appropriate material for this building, and would something more, something different be appropriate, and would within the scope of this, if we were to grant this permission, would a materials condition allow that to be considered, and maybe something slightly less funky, if that's the right word? I'm not sure that's a proper planning word, but would that be doable within the condition? Officers do feel that it's a high-quality contemporary material to reflect the contemporary nature of the development, and the mirror panelling does reflect, whilst the cars are in the image, it does also reflect the landscaping. However, I have had a discussion with the applicants about the materials, and they are willing to accept a condition to have materials to be submitted if committee feel that a more traditional approach would be appropriate, for example, brick or, again, the clay tiling. So the applicants are willing to accept a condition or render.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Wimborne?
Thank you, Chair. Could you confirm whether any of the trees are going to be lost, and also do the units have private amenity space?
There will be, in total, 9 trees to be removed, but they are very small trees and shrubs to be removed. So that's 9 in total across the site. The majority of landscaping on the boundaries will be retained. In relation to amenity space, each of the units does have their own private amenity space and a large communal garden.
Okay, thank you. No further questions. We have 5 people wishing to address us on this one. And since we don't have enough chairs, if I could ask just the first 2 to come forward first, please. We have Mr Knight and Mr Doe, who are objectors. If you'd both like to come forward, please. It's just one. Okay, then, please. Whichever of you is actually speaking, please do come forward. And we also had 2 people speaking. Well, one of the agent and also the architect. Are they both wishing to speak as well? They are. Okay. Well, in that case, we will take. Is it Mr. Knight or Mr. Doe? Mr. Knight. Mr. Knight, we'll take you first, then, and then I'll ask if you wouldn't mind stepping down from the chair, and then the other 2 gentlemen can speak afterwards. So you've got up to 3 minutes to tell us about your concerns about this application. Thank you.
Chair, members of the committee, there is much wrong with this excessive and over-ambitious application. I live next door at number 5, and we will be severely affected by the loss of daylight and privacy. The key issue is loss of daylight. We will suffer significant loss of light to 3 habitable rooms which face the development as shown. The officer's report is very finely balanced on this respect, twice using the phrase "on balance," but without giving this committee sufficient information for you to make up your own minds on fair judgment. The BRE guidelines envisage a daylight reduction of 20% as being a reasonable balance between an existing building and new development. Windows 9 and 10, a main living area, would suffer a daylight reduction of 66%. Losses of 40% are normally considered the maximum permissible, so losses of 66% would be severely detrimental. Yet this key fact was omitted from the officer's report. The applicant proposed an alternative approach, the validity of which was discredited by an independent daylight expert. Yet again, this was not mentioned in the planning officer's report. The planning department should be setting the daylight levels, not the applicant. BRE guidelines also recommend that any reduction of daylight below the 27% level should be kept to a minimum. The proposed development reduces the daylight of windows 9 and 10 to under 12%. That's a massive reduction, 58%. These damaging reductions, 66% below current levels and 58% below the BRE minimum, fail to meet the Council's obligations under policy UD8 to have regard to the maintenance of daylight amenities for occupiers of adjacent properties. We are being asked to accept much lower daylight levels than will apply to the proposed development. This is not a reasonable balance. Had the proposed development itself had such low daylight levels, it would not have been approved by the Planning Department. So why are we being forced to accept these low levels? In view of the demonstrable harm to our living conditions, I would urge the committee to refuse this application. The proposed development does not have to be this big. A smaller development would achieve a fairer balance between the parties and protect our light issues. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Knight. Mr. Knight, if you wouldn't mind stepping down, thank you. And I could ask Mr. Wallace and Mr. Marks to come forward, who are the agent and the architect. So, gentlemen, you've got up to 3 minutes to address us. Have you decided how you're going to split the time between you? And are you going to regulate yourselves, or do you want us to regulate you? So, minute and a half. Well, I'll just say it because we do often have a situation where people absolutely say they're going to only speak for a minute and a half, they then speak for 2 minutes, 50 seconds, and it all ends up in tears. So we will stop you at a minute and a half. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This scheme will deliver 5 new homes suitable for established and young families. It is a sustainable proposal incorporating a timber frame structure, air source heat pumps to help exceed carbon reduction targets, as well as low water usage and a green roof system. It has been carefully designed to not cause unacceptable impacts to neighbours. As set out in the committee report, using the mirror image approach is an accepted and appropriate methodology in these particular circumstances. And with that methodology, the scheme meets and exceeds the targets. The ADF test measuring light levels within neighbouring rooms is also passed. Outlook for neighbours is protected by staggering back upper floors of the building and setting the rear-built form in from the side boundary. The positioning of windows and the use of screening prevents intrusive overlooking. The scheme is not overdevelopment. There are a number of flatted blocks in the area, including permission next door. All the flats greatly exceed expected space standards and have their own amenity areas, plus a large communal garden. It's not a case of cramming in small flats. There's sufficient car parking is provided on site. There's no harmful impact on neighbours, and it exhibits good design.
I'm going to talk about the design, which is derived from a detailed analysis, both of the site itself, but also the wider context of neighbourhood streets. With regards to massing, we looked at our neighbours immediately flanking on either side at 5 and 23 Melville Avenue. Surveys and studies we conducted of neighbouring elevations helped to determine our proposed building lines, which include a number of setbacks at the front, rear and flank walls that are designed to respond sensitively and preserve neighbouring amenity. Facing onto Melville Avenue, our proposal aligns with its neighbours on either side. As number 23 projects substantially forward of number 5's building line, this dictated a stepped building line in plan, mediating between the two neighbours. We cloned the gable outlines from number 23 to continue their rhythm across our site. These fit comfortably 3 times, naturally subdividing the street elevation. The gables form the maximum height of our proposal, which comes in well over 1.5 metres lower than either of its neighbours. With regards to materiality, we chose to clad the building predominantly in earthy red clay tiles, a material found in abundance in the neighbourhood and indeed on both of the buildings immediately neighbouring us. The reflective facade is a mirror-polished stainless steel. It's been used on many buildings before, and it's a building of quality and longevity. At ground level and below, it will reflect its immediate surroundings of grasscrete, green planting and climbers, and serve to dematerialize the ground floor, creating the illusion of a house floating above a lush garden. At the rear, it reflects the garden and sky. This too will help to dissolve and disappear the ground floor projection. Other than the reflective facade, we have taken cues from the local context to develop our massing, proportions, building lines and materiality.
I'm afraid your time is up.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And Councillor Gatland, you have up to 3 minutes to tell us about your concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm here to support the objections of the residents of number 5 and the wider objections of the community to this application. I think Mr. Knight has expressed very well the impact this will have on his family. The effects of loss of daylight are well documented, and not only will the residents have to suffer reduced daylight, particularly in their family room, which is the centre of their home, but their outlook will be a blank wall of a 3-storey building, and the front door of the basement flat will be opposite it, even though it is considerably lower. Number 21 is probably now a development site, and it is an infill. It was originally, I believe, subdivided for a bungalow for the elderly parents of the owners, and I do regret the loss of yet another bungalow in Croydon. The plot, I believe, was subdivided in the 50s. It's not as large as other plots in the area, and is clearly an overdevelopment because a lot has been crammed in here. It has led to a building right up to the boundary of number 5. And though I welcome parking spaces on site, as I always do, they look very tight to me. And there are, of course, the refuse bins right at the front as well. And I do regret, as I always do, the loss of any trees. I do see that there is amenity space and green roofs, but the loss of established plants, grass and shrubs is a loss to all of us. The bulk and massing at the back is obtrusive and dominant, and the balconies at the back will cause loss of privacy for number 5 that the privacy screens will not overcome. I mean, there is a nod in the design to the original houses in the road, but I think the windows and that strange mirrors in the front, I think, strike a very jarring note, particularly beside a listed building. I mean, this is clearly an overdevelopment that is unacceptable damage to the amenities of the residents of number 5. And although in the report we are instructed to embrace the design, I really don't think it fits in this location and beside a listed building. And I'd ask the committee to look at this carefully and to refuse the application. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Officers have anything they wish to add? In particular, I think, regarding the daylighting issue, please, to the neighbours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Officers took a great deal of time to look at the daylight and sunlighting issues. It is an interesting plot, as the case officer set out. However, first off, the building BRE is guidance. And whilst it did not fail the vertical sky component, it also passed the alternative test, that of the mirror image, and the case officer will just pick up on a bit more detail on that. We are, however, satisfied that the impact will not be undue on the neighbouring occupants of the neighbouring property, bearing in mind that there is dual aspect of one of the key family rooms. So officers are satisfied in terms of the building BRE guidance, and bear in mind also that it's only one consideration that needs to be taken on board. In terms of whether the development is overdevelopment, the site is obviously right for development. It's a bungalow. It does not make a very efficient use of land. And in terms of how it sits on the plot, the proposals mirror and are in keeping with the neighbouring plots as well, which come right up to the boundary. We think it's a good, efficient use of land that will provide a good range of family units. And in terms of the balconies at the rear, in terms of what impact that might have on the privacy of surrounding occupants, there has been care taken to provide privacy screening. Finally, just to pick up on one point, the neighbouring property is not a listed building, it's only a locally listed building. Just turn to my to my colleague Laura if there's anything else you want to say on the daylight and sunlighting.
Thank you. The BRE, the BRE alternative mirror image approach is an approach which is outlined in the BRE guidance, and indeed the London Plan Housing SPG supports alternative targets and states local circumstances. The need for optimising housing supports this alternative target approach, and the scheme before us does meet that mirror image approach.
Could we, and I guess I'm betting this is probably what Councillor Audley is going to ask, could you say a little bit more about what you mean by the mirror imaging? We've got lots of mirrors going on in this scheme. Yeah, what is the mirror imaging effect? Councillor Audley, was that what you were going to ask?
Mirror imaging, but maybe just more in the round, as kind of simple as possible, really, as well. I appreciate it's really clear technically, but if you could translate that, that'd be helpful.
So the BRE guidance recommends that numerical values are purely advisory. So if a test isn't met, when there's local circumstances and unique circumstances, you can look at other alternative targets. For example, in a road where there's a vacant site and a neighbour enjoys particularly good outlook, which is not typical of an area, you can look at other approaches to looking at daylight and sunlight. So a mirror image approach is to take a house, which is, for example, number 5, and mirror image that outline and that elevation onto the existing site. So it's more of a rhythm and a rhythm of the street scene. So it's a more of a approach to assess daylight against what's typical in an area. So in this circumstance, they've mirror imaged number 5 onto the application site and then taken those daylight sunlight values. If that makes sense.
If I can add to that, it's sort of acknowledging that where you have a built form that is underdeveloped, but is out of character or out of that form, it's recognising, and it comes back to this whole issue that the London Plan alludes to, is that we're here to optimise development potential. If you've got something that is out of kilter with that predominant character, there's nothing wrong with it failing the BRE if it's meeting those other objectives, which this, we believe it is doing so. That's not talking about the detail, but it's actually... So that's why it's looking more practically at a mirror image of what could be achieved to meet that overall character of development that's in the street.
So essentially, I think what I'm understanding from this is where you've got an unusual situation, because normally most houses in a street like this, if you've got side windows, wouldn't really have much of an outlook or get too much light, and that's what people would expect. Where you've got an unusual situation, where you've got that tiny little bungalow that's there at the moment, it's unreasonable to say, well, actually, that's what you take as the lighting sort of level, because it's an unusual circumstance. So this is sort of set up to deal with that. Is that a correct interpretation?
Right, could we say, let's imagine we move 10 houses along, whatever that number is. Are we now saying that were this to be built, the lighting conditions for number 5 would be akin to number 15, 17, 13? So in the round, we're saying if it was built, then the situation would be no different as compared to many other properties on the street.
Okay, I think one thing that I'm struck with here, and discussions we've had over recent meetings as well, I think some of our next training we ought to be looking at, I think we've already started to discuss this, looking at daylighting, the BRE guidelines and how it all works, because it is quite an important aspect, and it's not necessarily as clear and obvious as one might expect.
So it just comes to my mind. So when the house, the number 5, was originally built, was it built? What was there when it was built? As in, was there was the bungalow there, or was there a larger property that meant it had less light when it was built, and now it has more light because that property went and a bungalow emerged, or was there no property to be considered, perhaps?
From the planning history, it does appear that that was part of the grounds of the existing number 5. So the bungalow was built in the 1950s. So it does appear that that was part of the land of number 5.
And can I just start, so whilst we're asking a few extra questions on this, what weight should we give the fact? Obviously, you've got that side elevation facing, it's very, very close to the boundary. But obviously you've got 3 other sides to this building. It's quite a substantial home. So then obviously the main facade to the back and the front, it would appear, and presumably they've got quite a big space to the other side, the southern side as well. So what sort of weight should we give to that? I mean, obviously, one would assume that the rest of the building gets a considerable amount of daylighting and sunlighting.
That's correct. Yeah, as you pointed out, there are several other bedrooms in the house. There are a lounge and several other rooms on the ground floor as well. These are only 3 rooms compared to a large house, and they do get good daylight.
Chair, if I may, Chair, I think the other consideration is that these flank windows are north-facing, so they don't receive any sunlight because they're 90 degrees due north of east or west. So therefore, that's another consideration around the value of the amenity that can be gained through those windows.
Okay, thank you. Right, committee, Councillor Perry, Councillor Khan, and I'll bring myself in.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I think it's fair to say that the existing bungalow is effectively out of keeping with the area, and I think it's probably fair to say that this could be a development site. Having said that, it's a site with huge constraints. The first one being there's a locally listed building on both sides. And as we've heard, number 5 has a number of flank windows looking onto this side because historically there wasn't a building there. And as we've heard, there's going to be a huge loss of light to those habitable rooms on or at number 5. And we're hearing this BRE may, the BRE is there, but if the guidelines don't work, we sort of come up with a different set of guidelines, and we then got into this mirror image argument, but the mirror image is not what's being built, so the impact is not what the mirror image is. The impact is actually bigger. And I think we should be recognising what people are losing, i.e. the residents of number 5, and recognising that we've heard tonight that the breakfast room is the hub of their home, and recognise the historical context and not a theoretical hypothesis of what the daylight and sunlight might be. That the reality is that the residents of number 5 will lose a huge amount of light, and it will have a terrible impact on the amenity of their property and the amenity of their breakfast room, which, as I say, we've heard is the hub of the home. So I think the light issue and the impact on number 5 is a huge issue. I think the design of the property is an issue. The mirror frontage, which could be overcome with different materials, the mirror frontage, I think, is a mistake. There are no other properties floating in Melville Avenue, and I don't think a floating property is going to be in character with Melville Avenue. And I think, so the locally listed buildings, we should be respecting that character of the locally listed buildings. Arguably, this proposal could have gone higher. Both buildings on both sides are higher, and this is actually sitting lower. Arguably, the building could have gone higher, and it could have been more respectful to number 5 and moved away from the boundary of number 5, therefore not having such a huge impact on those habitable rooms. So I think the design could have worked, but on the current basis it doesn't, because it's just far too close to the boundary of number 5. I think the rear elevation also gives me great concern, and I think the CGI showed that very clearly. We've got those huge sort of picture windows on every floor at the rear of this building. Huge windows that will be overlooking the rear gardens of 5 and 21, but 5 in particular because it will sit deeper than number 5, because this will sit deeper than number 5. And there's going to be a clear loss of privacy for residents there. So not only are they losing sunlight in what they regard as their main rooms of the house, when they go out into the garden to enjoy the sunlight, they'll be overlooked by these huge windows that are going to be incredibly dominant in the rear garden. So I think that also is a great concern. So I would move refusal of this application on grounds of impact on adjoining occupiers and character. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Khan.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to support approval for this application. It's going to provide us with much needed housing. And I look at it also and think, it's actually, the amenities are good in this area. There's 2 schools there. You know, there's tennis courts. I mean, schools particularly, and the park. And schooling particularly in our borough is also, an issue, securing sufficient places. I know we've cracked it to some degree as well, very well. But I see this as a real opportunity for the much-needed housing and an area that has good amenities in it. So I would like to support the application. Thank you.
Councillor Khan, are you moving approval? Right. Okay. Right. Thank you. Okay. I'll bring myself in, and then Councillor Wright. An interesting and clearly challenging site, sitting as it is between the 2 locally listed buildings. What's the most appropriate response to this? I think something that actually is a modern interpretation of arts and crafts is exactly the right thing to do. It's what typically you would see in a modern building, not something trying to copy the buildings that it sits next to. And I think that's a really important aspect of this. I think the triple gable is very much an arts and crafts sort of icon, actually, in terms of you get a lot of arts and crafts buildings that pick that up. And then the sort of modern use of what is a very nice material in terms of the terracotta tiles, hanging wall tiles and roof tiles. Again, would sit very nicely, very interestingly on this site. Clearly, the site is made somewhat more challenging by the neighbouring property. That's a substantial house that has its main windows very clearly on the front, back, and presumably to the south-facing side as well, but certainly to the front and the back. And I think the fact that historically there are some relatively modest-sized windows in the side should not be restricting the development that happens on this site, particularly given that the BRE have established a way of actually dealing with this kind of unusual circumstance. As Councillor Aldsley was saying, the sort of situation you'd get a little bit further up the road, to take that into account. And still, and taking that approach, those windows do receive a reasonable amount of daylighting into them. So the fact that there's going to be a reduction, clearly there will be a reduction, there will be an impact on the neighbours, is within acceptable recognised boundaries. I think going back then, though, to the design, I think one thing I'm not comfortable with, and I'm really, as people on the committee will know, very supportive of modern design, I simply don't see the reflected mirror bottom story working. I just don't fit. It's a step too far. It's a little bit too bling, if you like. This building is strong enough in its architecture not to need that. And I would certainly call on the condition regarding materials to revisit what's an appropriate solution there. I don't think we should dictate. I think the applicants and their architects should go away and reflect on this, if you excuse the pun, as to what might be a better sort of approach. I think they'll still have a really exciting, interesting series of new homes. And for those of you that have had the opportunity to take a look at the plans in any detail, there's some really interesting things happening there. They're going to be really fabulous places to live in, I'm sure. But, of course, importantly, meeting housing need as part of that solution. So I think it's a very well-designed scheme, very well considered, with that one small exception. And I'm happy to second the motion to approve this, subject to the strengthening of that, or what was the right way of putting it, that condition on the materials requiring a reconsideration of the ground floor level. Councillor Khan, are you happy with that point about the materials? Fine, great, thank you. Councillor Wright?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with you with the front mirror is something which really has to be rethought, there's no doubt about it. But I disagree with you on the design. I mean, the design from the back aspect, from the rear aspect, I think is just awful and terrible. And I think that, again, has to be rethought through, because the effect that will have upon the neighbours is quite emotional. But also, I think it's a great problem with its relationship to the neighbours, particularly number 5. There's too many things wrong with it, this particular development, although it is, as you say, a development site. So I would second refusal, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else wish to comment? No? In that case, we've got... Oh, sorry, Joy. Councillor Prince.
Just briefly, again, I would be happy to see the back of the reflective material at the front. I wanted to address the overlooking thing at the back. I mean, it's not unusual for back gardens to be overlooked by neighbouring houses. I mean, where I live, that's it. That's normal. And I think the houses are much closer together than they are here. So I think, although I do sympathise, obviously, with neighbours who've not been overlooked, becoming overlooked, it's not that unusual. And I think the additional housing provided is the trump card, really, so I'll be approving this.
I think that you're right. That sort of typical sort of side-by-side relationship that you get of houses in any or most urban areas where you look over each other's back gardens. It's part of urban living, really, isn't it? Okay. Councillor Trackers-Lawler.
Thank you very much, Chair. I won't add to what Councillor Khan and yourself have already said, but what I want to say is the presentation is fantastic, and I wish all presentations were put to us like this, and it really helps to bring the whole thing to life and to understand what will actually be going forward.
Mr. Smith?
Chair, I just wanted to, because there's been some mention around privacy, and I think it's important that in terms of the materials, but also the success of privacy screens. And I would suggest in condition 9, which is covering various details, that we do make explicit reference to the privacy screens, just to make sure that of their longevity, but also of their materiality, and then how they perform.
So they become like a permanent feature of that. Yes, I think that would be absolutely right. Okay, then. I'm not seeing anybody else indicating. So we've got 2 motions completed and before us. The first of those was for approval, moved by Councillor Khan and seconded by myself. The second was for refusal, moved by Councillor Perry and seconded by Councillor Wright. Before we go on the reasons for refusal, we'll take the first of those motions first. So can I see those in favour of approval?
6.
And those against?
4.
So that is approved, and then hence the second motion falls. Okay, thank you. And that is with the obviously the variance on those 2 conditions, part of that. Okay, then, thank you. Brings us on to the third and final item for consideration at this meeting, which is item 7.1, 123 Foxley Lane in Purley. Presenting officer is Laura Field. And Laura, when you're ready, please.
Thank you, Chair. This application is at number 123 Foxley Lane, Purley, for the demolition of the existing building, erection of a two-storey building with accommodation in the roof space for one one-bedroom flat and 8 two-bedroom flats, formation of vehicular access, provision of parking, bins and bike storage. This slide shows the application site in context outlined in red. The application site is a large detached house with various outbuildings, including garages. The vehicular access is from Foxley Lane and sweeps around the site for various car parking. The landscaping in the front of the site is a feature of the road, and indeed one of the trees is subject to a preservation order. Towards the rear of the site is the Webb Estate Conservation Area with grey timbers to the rear of the site here. No. Okay. So, so Foxley Lane is characterised by large plots, large buildings on large plots. The application site has a garden of approximately 44 metres. There are infill properties in the near vicinity, including the neighbouring property towards the south of the site. The photograph shows the application site here with the protected tree and the large detached house. You can see to the side of the property with the estate agent board is the new infill property. The other side of the photograph is number 123A Foxley Lane. This photograph shows the landscaping mostly to be retained as part of the development and the relationship between number 123A Foxley Lane. As you can see, there are no habitable room windows in that elevation. The photograph shows the other side of the site, which is the new build infill house. This is the rear of the site and the Webb Estate with grey timbers. This is the site plan outlined in red. So the application site utilises the existing vehicular access and sweeps around the application site to form the basement parking. The landscaping at the frontage is retained, including the TPO tree, and that responds to that character of the area which we saw in the photograph. The site plan also shows the relationship between the neighbouring properties, the infill property and 123A Foxley Lane. The building does not extend beyond the rear building of the infill property and steps away from the boundary of 123A, again responding to that relationship between the neighbouring properties. This slide shows how the basement car parking works. As I said, the driveway has vehicular access from Foxley Lane and is for 10 car parking spaces, including the disabled spaces. The front elevation and the side elevation is in the next slide here. It shows the site in relationship to the infill house there. It picks up on the traditional arts and crafts houses of the Webb Estate and indeed some of Foxley Lane, and it has the symmetrical appearance and picks up on the hipped features of the properties in Foxley Lane. The rear of the site responds again to some of those features with the hipped features of the road and allows for private amenity space for each of the proposed dwellings. The side elevation responds to the potential issues of privacy by having no windows above first floor level. This slide shows the proposal in relationship to Foxley Lane. Again, it picks up on the height differences with the neighbouring property and responds to the height within the street scene. Again, as you can see by the properties of the original house of the infill, it responds well to the proportions, massing and design of Foxley Lane. The top slide is without the landscaping, and the bottom slide is with the landscaping as it picks up on the landscaping features of Foxley Lane, which is characteristic of the road. Thank you, Chair. The application is recommended for approval.
Thank you. Questions for clarification? Councillor Clancy.
Thanks, Chair. Where would the refuse facilities be proposed to be relocated? Is that next to the gym? That's the first question. Also, materials for the road to be used. Can you enlighten us as to that? That was brought out in the report. And then lastly, I couldn't see in the report a density figure for the development. Do you have that?
So the refuse storage is proposed to be on the frontage of the property, which officers have found to be unacceptable. So we have conditioned the refuse details to be submitted and agreed with officers.
Councillor Clancy, I don't think we need to look at that in detail. There might be better locations within the garden to accommodate that refuse storage. I don't necessarily advocate. It might be, there might be options within the basement, but again, that makes collection maybe more difficult. But there are options. It's a large site, and there are options for refuse storage. But we just want to make sure that it actually works in terms of that garden character.
Sorry, and what was your second question?
The use of, I think, of tarmac in the report was predicated against. I wondered what officers were favouring in substitute of tarmac for the access road. And then the last question was that the report seemed to lack a density figure for the development.
In relation to the material for the driveways, we were potentially looking at a permeable surface, something that's more akin to the road. So it could be the use of grasscrete or something along those lines. But that, again, is subject to condition.
I'm afraid we haven't got a density figure for you, Councillor Clancy. Looking at the, and comparing it with other sites and even the sites that we've been talking about elsewhere, we have a one-bed unit and 8 two-bed units. We can see the size of the site compared to, say, for example, the site at Rectory Park is substantially larger, and the PTAL is around the same. I would say that it's a reasonable density in terms of the size of this site. Again, looking at the implications of density in terms of character, in terms of impact, in terms of car parking, in terms of amenity space, private and communal, even irrespective of the density that was arrived at figuratively, it is not overdevelopment of this site. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Tracus-Lawler?
Thank you very much, Chair. In the conditions at the beginning of the report, point 8 refers to a time limit of 3 years. Is that in relation to construction works or the planning approval process?
So that the limit of 3 years is a time limit under the Town and Country Planning Act. It's the time limit to start works on site.
Okay, if there are no further questions, we have 3 people wishing to address us on this one. We have Mr Telling and Mr Austin, who are the agent and applicant. Would you like to come forward, gentlemen? And then we also have Councillor Kadir as well, if you'd like to come forward, Councillor. So, gentlemen speaking in favour of the application, you have up to 3 minutes between you. Have you agreed how you are splitting your time? Down the middle? OK, we will do that for you, no problem at all. So, when you're ready, please, and just push the button on the front and the little red, that's it. Great.
Do we not hear objections first?
There is nobody speaking as an objector on this application. So.
OK, thank you, Chair. Sorry, I thought the councillor was objecting. I wasn't aware of that. Anyway, I'd just like to say that this is a quality development that we've tried to engage with the local. We contacted the councillor. We wanted to ensure that we address people's concerns in regards to the building of this development. In terms of size, we have tried to conform with the national housing guidelines and the GLA guidelines. We've looked at the characteristics of the road, some of the buildings further down the road. There seems to be some similar developments that have taken place in the area, so it's not out of keeping with what's happening on Foxley Lane. Planning permission was recently granted, and there's been a new development to the side of this development regarding if any issues regarding the overlooking of the development. We're on the existing border. We intend to keep the same boundary line as is there. There's also been planning permission granted on the site already to extend the footprint, so we're trying to work.
Thank you. That is 1.5 minutes. So, please to swap.
So, right. Thank you. The context of Foxley Lane has been discussed is one of varied size houses, but generally large houses on large plots. There is substantial precedent, I think, set along the road and in the area of developments being brought forward in this context, and they are of a type of large development, large detached dwellings of an approach. This is something we have taken as a principal criteria for looking at this, so it is working with the context and the precedents that's been set by the council today. Just a word on, I guess, the design principles that have been brought forward. The development is a sustainable redevelopment, we feel, on of use an existing residential site. It provides for massing of a scheme that is born from the context of the road. So the overall massing, the height of the ridge, the height of the eaves context is born from the neighbouring units. The idealistic interpretation of how the roof, the scale of the dwellings, the scale of fenestration, the symmetrical approach, all have been taken forward from comments gained from the council officer in dialogue with them. So I think to conclude, we feel it's a reasonable and an appropriate redevelopment of the site. It's in keeping both in terms of scale, mass, with the existing context.
Okay, thank you.
All right,
Sorry, 3 minutes are up, but thank you very much. Councillor Kadir, you have up to 3 minutes to tell us about your concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I'd like to make a clarification. The architect has contacted me. By the time they have submitted this application, and I already had the referral. It's a shame had they contacted me earlier, we could have worked together to put our concerns. Our main concern is, I think, this property, the development is too large for its sites, and the bound is very close to the boundaries. The privacy would be difficult for the neighbors. And there are lots of objectors, and I support all the objectors because it will also change the street scene as well. We do admit there are lots of development taking at Foxley Lane, and this development, in principle, we don't have a problem, but I think it's just too big for its size. If they would reconsider and making slightly making the boundary slightly bigger for the neighbors to
then I think that would be an advisable move. On this application as it is, I urge you all to reject this application. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Do officers have anything they wish to add?
Just to say that officers are satisfied in terms of the size of the dwelling on the plot. It's not out of character. It's a well-designed quality piece of development that really respects, we believe, the rhythm and pattern of development in the area. And it also respects in terms of really good quality design, respects the neighbouring conservation area of the Webb Estate. It provides 9 flats, which include 8 two-beds. So it's a very efficient use of land and contributes to the housing shortage in the borough and London nationally. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Clancy, then I'll bring myself in.
Thank you, Chair. It's a shame we can't consider a density figure tonight, because I do think that this is an overdevelopment. It's just cramming too much in. It's too many units in this area, and the development, as we've seen, would be larger in footprint than the building it replaces. It clearly increases the density in an area which is in a relatively remote location, as shown by the public transport accessibility score of 1B, which is the worst of all. So, on that, I would like to welcome the parking provision, which is one-on-one and seems fairly generous, but wonder, in fact, if it could be made more generous because of the P-TAL of 1B. I also have concerns about the impact on the Webb Estate conservation area. The key question for me is whether the development would enhance the conservation area, and I don't think this does. Maybe it's the drabness of the drawings, but in design and appearance, I don't get the impression it would enhance the conservation area. It's too bulky, its massing is over-dominant, and it builds right up to the boundaries, and as a result, I think neighbours will feel a loss of privacy and overlooked. Now, I recognise there's a need to build more housing, but I don't think we should be pursuing that policy at any cost. A smaller development, perhaps accommodating half the number of units proposed, would be acceptable and more appropriate. So, for those reasons, Chair, I propose refusal.
Okay.
I'd just like to respond on a couple of points. We've had a lot of discussion about density. Density, as I've said before, is just a rough rule of thumb. The important element to consider is the urban design. Does it work in urban design terms? And officers are quite confident that it does. It's also got adequate car parking provision. The other point I really think is important to pick up is about the conservation area. In terms of conservation areas, the policy is to preserve or enhance. We actually feel that this very much preserves and probably enhances the conservation area, but the test is to preserve or enhance. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll come in next myself. Clearly there's a reasonably large house on the site at the moment. Probably not one of the more impressive ones in the street scene, but there is a reasonably substantial property there already. I think the scheme here, it is larger, clearly, but I think it's very well designed. I like the way it sort of reflects, and you can't really see it on there, but numbers 125 and 127 are a pair of semis, and it very much sort of reflects the scale and form of those with the two sort of bay features. I've had a chance to look at some of the drawings for this prior to the meeting online, and I think it's been very well thought out. In terms of arts and crafts design, it picks up on very many of the sort of features, very many of the sort of well, it's a good reflection of that sort of style, and hence I think would fit in very well with the conservation area, although it's obviously on the border of the conservation area, and it would enhance the local area, both its neighbours and to what happens to the rear. It's actually a very it's quite a wide building, and it sits fairly close to the boundaries. It doesn't project back, so there's a sort of a bit of a play-off here. It's a sort of long, thin building rather than being a deeper one projecting into the back, and I think that's the right approach as well. Providing 8 two-bed flats and 1 one-bed flat is clearly going to help providing desperately needed homes. But actually the parking provision, and not having a big forecourt out the front, but having the car parking tucked underneath the building, I think is a really good approach as well. And that will help with the sort of garden feel be retained. It's good to see the existing, the TPO tree maintained, and then obviously a lot of greenery at the front, so you can see on that the rather slightly garish green on the drawing there. You can't miss that level of greenery that will be there to the frontage. Going back to the parking for a moment, there is one additional space above and beyond policy, so that there is a nod to a reflection of the PTEL rating, but I think that level of parking with two wheelchair users parking spaces is very acceptable. So I think it's a good scheme, well thought out. They've clearly looked at it carefully in terms of the context. So more than happy to move approval on this application. I've next seen Councillor Kabir, then Councillor Wimborne, then Councillor Audsley.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to second the approval because where I see it, I can see it's just a good development, very reasonable, two-story with loft extension. I mean, it's very reasonable. It's everywhere you go. I mean, if we look at our last 10 planning application, we have dealt with much higher stories and all that. So I think it's a very reasonable, so I'm going to second it.
Councillor Wimborne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly agree with Councillor Gantz's concerns over this development. I feel it is very much an overdevelopment, and therefore I will second refusal.
Okay, Councillor Audsley. No, Councillor Audsley doesn't wish to speak. Does anybody else wish to speak on this application? Councillor Prince.
Yes, just briefly to say, I appreciate that the proposed building doesn't project back, as so many often do, which is a good thing because that's the direction that points in the direction of the conservation area. With regard to the increased width compared to the existing boundary, I think the officer said there were no habitable rooms on those flanks, no windows to inhabitable rooms. So I think, given that this helps towards our housing targets, then I certainly would support it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I can't see anybody else indicating. So we have two motions before us then. First of those was for approval, moved by myself and seconded by Councillor Kabir. And then we had the second one for refusal, moved by Councillor Clancy and seconded by Councillor Wimborne. So taking the first of those first, can I see those in favour of approval?
7.
Thank you. And those against?
3.
So that is approved. And the second motion falls. Thank you very much. That brings this meeting to a close, and we will have a 5-minute break, and then we'll start with the subcommittee.